there's a question I want you to think about before we get into today's episode. If a political operation gets caught, genuinely caught, publicly, undeniably caught, associating with white supremacists, what should happen next? In a healthy democracy, the answer probably involves accountability, consequences, a reckoning of some kind. Donors pull back, candidates distance themselves, the operation loses credibility and influence. Now, let me tell you what actually happened. The operation changed its name, kept its money, kept its candidates, won 11 out of 28 House races it targeted, and the candidate it had backed with over $1 million 5 years earlier, a woman who had become a culture war celebrity on the strength of defying a pandemic shutdown order, won her race by 7 points. That's not a story about accountability. That's a story about what happens when there's enough money to simply outlast the scandal. And it's a story about what that means for the voters who never got to weigh in on any of it. Welcome back to Ethos Trek. I'm Sera Grey. This is Who Bought Your Ballot? And this is episode 3. Previously in this series, in episode 1, we built the consent framework, the argument that democratic consent requires the integrity of the choice presented, not just the act of voting. In episode 2, we followed Tim Dunn's money to Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor of Texas, who received $3 million from Dunn-backed groups and then presided as judge over the impeachment trial of a politician Dunn had spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars supporting. Today, we're going to look at what the Dunn network does when it gets caught, and why getting caught didn't stop it. To understand Shelley Luther's story, you need to understand the organization that made her politically viable and what happened to it. Defend Texas Liberty was Tim Dunn's primary political action committee. By the beginning of 2023, he had put nearly $10 million into it. It was the financial engine behind his strategy of primarying Republican incumbents he deemed insufficiently loyal to his agenda, targeting sitting members of his own party, funding challengers, and systematically pulling the Texas House and Senate further to the right. In October 2023, just weeks after the Paxton impeachment acquittal, the Texas Tribune reported that Jonathan Strickland, the president of Defend Texas Liberty, had hosted a meeting with Nick Fuentes. If that name isn't familiar, Nick Fuentes is a prominent white nationalist and anti-Semite, a figure so extreme that he has been condemned across the political spectrum, including by many prominent conservatives. Hosting him isn't a political misstep. It's a signal about who you are willing to sit in a room with. The fallout was immediate and public. Republican lawmakers who had accepted Dunn's money were suddenly being asked whether they would return it. Dan Patrick, the same Dan Patrick who had just received $3 million from the PAC, issued a statement through his office saying Dunn acknowledged the Strickland meeting was a, quote, blunder, unquote. Strickland was quietly removed as president of Defend Texas Liberty. Subsequent reporting by the Texas Tribune revealed additional ties between white supremacist networks and groups in the Dunn orbit. The calls for accountability grew louder. Several Republicans publicly said they would not accept money from Defend Texas Liberty going forward. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like the network might actually face consequences. In December 2023, approximately 2 months after the Fuentes scandal broke, a new political action committee was formed. It was called Texans United for a Conservative Majority. Its logo depicted the Texas Capitol building with a Christian cross on top. Its initial funding came from two sources: a firm tied to Tim Dunn called Hexagon Partners, which contributed $700,000, and Ferris Wilks, Dunn's longtime political partner, a fellow West Texas fracking billionaire, who contributed $1.3 million. Together, $2 million reported in a filing that was submitted one day late. Defend Texas Liberty did not disappear overnight. It lingered through the early part of the 2024 cycle. But the money, the real money, the operational money, moved to the new vehicle. New name, new logo, same donors, same targets, same strategy. I want to pause on this for a moment because it matters for the consent argument. When a corporation faces a catastrophic scandal and rebrands, new name, new packaging, same product, consumer advocates call it reputation laundering. What happened here is the political equivalent. The network that had become too toxic to operate under its existing name did not fundamentally change its ideology, its methods, or its financial backing. It changed its letterhead. And because our campaign finance disclosure system tracks committee names rather than the human networks behind them, that rebrand created just enough distance to allow donors and candidates to re-engage without the taint of the Fuentes Association following them into the next cycle. Voters in the district those candidates ran in had no particular reason to know that Texans United for a conservative majority was Defend Texas Liberty with a new name. That information was available. It's in the public record. It was reported by the Texas Tribune, but it required the kind of research that most working people with jobs and families and lives simply don't have time to do. That gap between what is technically disclosed and what voters actually know is where a great deal of the consent problem lives. Now let's talk about the candidate. Shelley Luther became a national figure in April 2020 when she reopened her hair salon in Dallas in defiance of the state's pandemic shutdown order. She was cited, fined, and briefly jailed after refusing to apologize to a judge who gave her the option of paying a fine and expressing remorse in exchange for her release. She said no. The image of her standing in a Dallas courtroom saying she had to feed her employees circulated widely. She became very quickly a symbol for a particular kind of defiance and a cause célèbre in right-wing media. Tim Dunn had apparently been watching. In 2020, Dunn backed Luther's campaign for a Texas Senate seat. He gave her more than $1 million. She lost. Let me say that again clearly because it matters. Tim Dunn, the most effective political donor in Texas, put over $1 million behind Shelley Luther in 2020, and she still lost. That's how much the original investment cost. That was not a deterrent. In 2024, Luther ran again, this time for Texas House District 62, challenging incumbent Republican Reggie Smith. Texans United for a conservative majority, the rebranded Dunn and Wilkes vehicle, contributed more than $183,000 to her campaign. She won. She beat Smith by 7 percentage points, a 24-point swing from the 2022 primary. Smith, for context, was among the Republicans who had voted to impeach Ken Paxton. You will notice that theme recurring. I want to be clear about what I'm documenting here and what I'm not. I'm not saying Shelley Luther is unqualified because Tim Dunn backed her. I'm saying that the voters of House District 62 deserve to know that their primary race was substantially shaped by the financial infrastructure of a West Texas billionaire with a specific ideological agenda. A billionaire who had already invested over $1 million in this candidate once before, who operates through a network that had been publicly associated with white supremacist figures, and who simply rebranded that network and kept going. Whether Luther is the right representative for District 62 is a question the voters of District 62 get to answer. My question, the consent question, is whether those voters had the information they needed to understand whose money was framing their choices. Standing back from the individual races, let's look at the pattern. Because the Luther story isn't really about Shelley Luther. It's about a methodology. The Dunn Playbook, as documented across multiple election cycles and reported by the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, Rolling Stone, and others, works roughly like this. Identify Republican incumbents who have deviated from the agenda, voted wrong on a budget, supported a moderate speaker, voted to impeach an ally. Fund a primary challenger with enough money to run a real campaign. Use affiliated media, specifically Texas Scoreboard, a Dunn-linked outlet, to define the incumbent as a sellout, a rhino, insufficiently conservative. Repeat across enough districts simultaneously that the message becomes ambient. Cross the network, and you will face a well-funded primary challenge. The result, over time, is a legislature where members understand the incentives, not because anyone told them explicitly, because they watched what happened to their colleagues. That's how institutional culture shifts, without anyone issuing a memo. And here's the piece that connects most directly with the consent framework. The voters in these primary races didn't create those incentives. They didn't design that system. They showed up and voted for candidates who had been pre-selected, pre-funded, and pre-positioned by a network they may never have heard of, operating through PAC names that changed after scandal and continued as if nothing had happened. The resilience of the playbook is not an accident. It is the direct result of having enough money to absorb scandal, rebrand, and keep operating. Accountability requires consequences. Consequences require leverage. And in the current campaign finance environment, the leverage runs almost entirely in one direction. Let's come back to the question I opened with. If a political operation gets caught associating with white supremacists, what should happen? The answer, in a functioning accountability system, is that it should cost something real. Not just a statement, not just a personnel change, something that actually changes the calculus. What happened instead was a 2-month pause, a new name, and 11 wins out of 28 targeted races. That is not a story about one candidate, or one PAC, or one scandal. That is a story about what money can do to accountability itself. It can function as kind of a political insulation, absorbing damage that would destroy a less resourced operation, and continuing forward largely intact. And the voters in those 28 districts, the people who showed up, made their choices, exercised their democratic right, most of them had no idea that the viable field they were choosing from had been shaped by a network that had just been publicly associated with a white nationalist, rebranded in December, and was already spending again by January. That's the consent problem. Not in the abstract, right here. Next episode, the Dunn Playbook doesn't require Tim Dunn. We're going to look at a first-time candidate for the Texas Senate named Rhonda Ward, a single donor who has almost single-handedly funded her campaign to the tune of nearly $2 million, and what her race tells us about what happens when the model spreads beyond the man who built it. I'm Sera Grey. This is Ethos Trek. If you like this content, please like this video. Share it with someone you think should hear it. Consider subscribing. It's totally free, and it helps us out with the algorithm. Ethos Trek is also on Substack and Blue Sky. There's also an audio version on Spotify.